This haunting was witnessed by multiple police officers, the local fire service, priests and neighbours. It all started on Saturday the 23rd of November 1974 at 966 Lindley Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So Laura Goodin was in the kitchen moving groceries from the table when suddenly the table lifted from the ground, flipped over and crashed to the floor. Just seconds later, the refrigerator on the other side of the kitchen lifted inches off the ground, turned mid-air and slammed back down to the ground. As Laura backed away from the fridge in complete disbelief, a large TV that was in the kitchen flipped off its stand and crashed down onto her foot, crushing two of her toes. Laura screamed in agony. What happened next at that house would go on to become one of the most documented cases of poltergeist activity in American history. This is part 1 of the Bridgeport Poltergeist Incident. In 1960, newlywed couple Jerry and Laura Goodin felt an enormous sense of pride as they just bought their first home at 966 Lindley Street. It was nothing special, just a modest 4-bedroom bungalow-style house in the north of Bridgeport, the busiest city in Connecticut. At just 738 square feet, the bungalow wasn't big by any stretch of the imagination, but to the Goodins, it was perfect. A quiet little house on a quiet little street. It was exactly what they wanted, and all they needed. It was their little piece of happiness. It really was the kind of place many people picture when they think about starting a family life together. Not too overwhelming, but big enough for their family to grow. And that's exactly how it remained, for a while. Jerry Goodin had grown up in a devout Catholic family. Religion was a major part of his life growing up. He would visit the local church with his family every week without fail. In fact, it was his dream that one day he could become a priest. But unfortunately for Jerry, those dreams didn't survive the Great Depression. Like so many others around that time, he had to grow up fast. He joined the Air Force, then spent the rest of his working life as a maintenance worker in a factory at Harvey Hubble Inc. He very soon became a prominent figure around the neighbourhood. A kind, dependable man. Warm and welcoming, generous and humble, always willing to lend a helping hand when others needed it. His wife, Laura, was much quieter, far less approachable some might say, through no fault of her own. She came from a loving Native American family and was raised in a more isolated setting which made her shy and reserved. She meant no harm, she wasn't spiteful, bitter or mean, just a bit more private, it's just how she was. You know the old saying, opposites attract. And with Jerry, she had found a partner who gave her space to feel safe. And for a while, that was all they needed for now. But what the Goodins really wanted, what they both craved more than anything, was a child. And on October 31st, 1961, just a year after moving in, the Goodins' wish came true. They really felt like all of their prayers had been answered when they were blessed with a baby boy. Gerard Goodin Jr. He truly was the apple of their eye. They doted on him. He made the couple feel like they were just absolutely bursting with love. Jerry's job paid the bills. Laura stayed at home to take care of Jerry Jr. The house felt like more than just a home. It was their sanctuary, and they poured every ounce of their energy into being good parents. But then one day, seemingly totally out of the blue, a neighbour made a passing comment. It was one of those offhand remarks that sticks in your brain like a splinter. The neighbour asked the Goodins why little Jerry Jr. always seemed to have his head hanging low. It was something the Goodins had noticed themselves, but deep down, kinda just hoped it would correct itself. But now that others had noticed, the Goodins were becoming more concerned and decided it was probably best to seek professional medical advice. They took 6-month-old Jerry Jr. to see the doctor, and well, the diagnosis was devastating. Their son had cerebral palsy. The Goodins just couldn't believe what they were hearing. They were living the perfect life up until this point. Jerry Jr. seemed perfectly healthy. It was definitely a huge blow. This kind of news has a massive impact on the course of a family's entire life. But after the initial shock of the diagnosis had settled down, the Goodins just took it all in their stride and got on with life. They never hired a babysitter. They took Jerry Jr. everywhere and did everything for him themselves. At times, of course, it was a struggle, sure, but they scrimped and saved to make sure he had absolutely everything he needed. And despite his challenges, he was described as a cheerful little boy, always laughing, full of life. But life, as we know, doesn't always reward love with mercy. And this story is a prime example that you really never know what's around the corner. And in 1967, tragedy struck. A simple cold took hold of Jerry Jr., and because of his condition, he deteriorated rapidly. Within days, at just 6 years old, 3 days before his 7th birthday, Jerry Jr. was cruelly taken away. Overwhelmed with grief and sorrow, Jerry and Laura were completely crushed by the loss. As with any loving, devoted parent, losing their son who had been their entire world was a devastating, earth-shattering blow that honestly, they felt like they'd never recover from. The grief hit the Goodins like a tidal wave. Jerry Jr. had been the centre of their universe. Everything revolved around him. Their love for him was total, and when he was gone, they felt like their entire world had collapsed. They had a photograph taken of him in his casket, which seems almost like a quietly desperate final attempt to cling to their memory of him. It's truly heartbreaking. Along with the photograph, they took home the artificial flowers that had sat atop his coffin during the funeral. They kept them displayed as a kind of homemade memorial for their little boy. But at the burial, as the dirt was still being piled over their son's grave, the local priest, Father Grimes, asked a question that personally I find incredibly insensitive and, to be honest, downright inappropriate. He turned to the grieving couple and asked a question that left a chill in the air. Have you ever thought about adopting? I mean, come on, read the room. This isn't exactly the time or place to be asking questions like that. Honestly, it kind of pissed me off when I read this bit. Give them time to come to terms with the loss of their child. And even then, that's a discussion to be had between themselves. It's not exactly an off-the-cuff decision to make at any time, let alone on the day you're laying your child to rest. Div. And things are about to get even worse for the couple. Now you might be thinking, how could things possibly get even worse? Well, the very next day, literally the day after Jerry Jr. was laid to rest, Laura was rushed to hospital. She received the news that nobody ever wants to hear. Doctors had discovered a tumour, and she was immediately scheduled for a hysterectomy. Now, if ever life was trying to keep someone down, this was it. Because although surgery saved her life and spared her from cancer, it also took away the couple's ability to have more children. And just like that, the Goodins found themselves spiralling in a perfect storm of grief. Not only had their world come tumbling down, but now the possibility of rebuilding that world one day had also been taken away from them. For the next 6 months, they visited Jerry Jr.'s grave every single day, and at home, they lit candles and prayed in front of their son's memorial in their living room. I genuinely think that this would have broken most people, physically, mentally, and emotionally, but somehow the Goodins held on. They clung to each other, and eventually, through their faith in God, to a faint glimmer of hope. Months later, when they were ready, they returned to Father Grimes, and this time they were the ones asking about the possibility of adoption. Well aware of what Jerry and Laura had been through, the community really rallied behind the couple. Neighbours, friends and family, in fact a total of 25 people wrote letters to the adoption agency vouching for Jerry and Laura, testifying to their love, strength and their absolute dedication as parents. And then, finally, in May of 1968, after months of uncertainty, the phone rang, and Jerry answered. Laura could tell immediately by the tone of Jerry's voice that whoever he was speaking to, it was good news. He seemed elated. Yes, of course, we'll come and see her. It was the news they had desperately been hoping for. There was a 4-year-old girl, a Native American child of Seneca heritage. She was currently living in Canada, and she desperately needed a loving new home. Jerry and Laura didn't hesitate. The phone had barely touched back down on the receiver when they packed up the car and drove 18 hours straight to Ontario. And that was the day they met Marcia. To understand why it was so crucial for Marcia to be embraced into a loving family, we need to take a look back at her life up until this point. You see, Marcia's early life had been hard. She was one of 9 children. Now I can't figure out if she was the 9th child or if she had 9 siblings. Let's just say there was a lot of competition for love and attention. Sadly, reports from the agency suggested that Marcia had suffered badly from serious neglect. In fact, in one disturbing account, and this really fucking pissed me off when I read it, Marcia had been tied to a chair for long periods of time and abandoned. When the Goodins arrived in Ontario, all of that excitement that had been channeled had suddenly started to waver slightly. They began asking themselves all sorts of questions, which I can imagine is perfectly normal given the circumstances. This was a huge commitment to undertake, not just for them, but for the child too. Were they really ready? What if Marcia didn't like them? What if they couldn't warm to her? Could they offer her structure, consistency and the love that she really needed? All of these questions were going around and around in their heads, and for a moment, they really began to doubt whether they were doing the right thing. But then, something extraordinary happened. The little girl, Marcia, ran straight into their arms. No hesitation, no fear. It was as if she'd been waiting for them all along. And Jerry and Laura, they fell in love instantly, and they embraced her immediately. The adoption agency felt that Laura's Native American heritage made her a good cultural match for Marcia. And so, with papers signed and hearts overflowing with love and affection, the Goodins brought Marcia home. They didn't waste any time. Jerry even transformed the large wardrobe in their bedroom into a makeshift room just for Marcia. Her own little space in the world, at least. Now, I'm not really sure why he had to convert a wardrobe. From my own research, although the property was small, it had 4 bedrooms, or so I'm led to believe. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But love, no matter how fierce, isn't always enough to undo the damage of the past, or the trauma of the present. As much as the Goodins adored Marcia, and they really did, their overprotectiveness became almost suffocating. Marcia had gone from no love, no affection, no attention, to now being adored, and to some degree, even smothered. But who could really blame the Goodins after what they'd been through? I mean, they'd already lost one child. It goes without saying they simply couldn't bear the thought of losing another. Laura, in particular, became especially cautious and, well, kind of overbearing. She would only allow Marcia to play with other children if they came over to play at their house, which, unfortunately, didn't happen often. There simply weren't many kids Marcia's age in the neighbourhood. She walked her to and from school every day, watched her closely, observing and monitoring her every move. And so, sadly, Marcia, despite being loved and adored, quickly became a very lonely child. Neighbours would later recall seeing Marcia in the living room playing Monopoly alone, talking to herself as she moved pieces around the board with nobody to play with. Always the banker, the player and the bystander all rolled into one. Obviously, she was a damn sight better off here than she was back in Ontario, but I just can't help find this heartbreaking too. I really hate seeing children playing on their own, it's just so fucking sad. But Laura just wouldn't let Marcia out of her sights, not because she didn't trust her, but because she didn't trust the world. She had first-hand experience of how easily and quickly a loved one can be taken away. And so, Marcia grew up under a protective shadow, safe from harm, loved, but lonely. Despite the solitude, all in all, the home was very happy. It was a loving environment that was further galvanised by individual traumas. Everything was lining up nicely for a fairy tale ending. But if you think this is a happy story, think again. At first, it was just little things, hardly even noticeable actually. I've covered a fair few cases now where poltergeist activity was involved, and they all seem to follow a familiar pattern. Everyday household items started to disappear, sometimes for days or even weeks at a time, and then mysteriously reappear somewhere completely random. Keys, remote controls, cutlery, even Marcia's toys would completely vanish, then turn up again unannounced. The kind of thing you could be forgiven for brushing off as forgetfulness, probably chalk it up to absent-mindedness and move on. But in the Goodin home, these small incidents became more and more noticeable as they started to inconvenience the family. These incidents were just a taster of what was to come, and what was to come would become one of the most terrifying, most documented cases of poltergeist activity in American history. So, about a year after Marcia moved in, the Goodins began inviting a little girl called Rosemarie over to play with her. Rosemarie was the young daughter of their close friends, the Hoffmans. She was one of the very few children Laura would trust enough to allow over to play with Marcia. One afternoon, the girls were playing together in the living room with Marcia's favourite dolls, when their play was interrupted by a strange sensation. The sofa they were both sitting on started to shift slightly underneath them, almost as if someone was nudging it with their foot. Then, without warning, the entire sofa lifted into the air momentarily before crashing back down to the ground. Absolutely petrified, Rosemarie jumped up from the sofa and bolted as fast as she could into the kitchen, pale and wide-eyed. The adults who were chatting could see straight away that Rosemarie had evidently been unnerved by something.
The sofa,
she stammered. Her heart was racing to the extent she struggled to get the words out.
It lifted off the ground.
The adults in the kitchen paused for a few seconds, examining Rosemarie, before each of them exchanged a curious look, then almost simultaneously began to laugh it off. We all know that kids can and often do have wild imaginations, so the adults just presumed that this must have been part of a game that the girls had created. They asked Rosemarie how Marcia had reacted to the sofa floating off the ground. Worryingly, Rosemarie responded by telling the grown-ups that Marcia just kind of sat there, smiling, like it was an everyday occurrence. And maybe, for Marcia, it was. But this wasn't the first odd thing that Rosemarie had noticed when she visited the Goodins' house. She would often find Marcia alone, talking quietly to her large collection of teddy bears. Rosemarie always found this behaviour kind of peculiar, but not much more than that. That was until one day when she interrupted Marcia and asked who she was talking to. Marcia's response sent a chill down her spine. Calm and composed, Marcia turned to Rosemarie, flicked her hair out of her face and said,
"Oh, I was just talking to my grandfather. I can talk to him whenever I want, but he's not happy that I was taken away from my birth home."
By November of 1971, incidents in the Goodin household had started to escalate and their patience was wearing thin. They'd begun hearing a strange periodic pounding against the walls, as though someone was throwing large rocks or bricks from outside. Growing more and more frustrated, the Goodins decided to phone the local police lieutenant to file a complaint. Something strange was happening at their house. The problem was, every time they ran outside to catch the culprits in action, there would be nobody there. No kids playing pranks, no vandals, no one. The pounding would start soft and quiet, like a faint knock here and there, but then it would grow in intensity. It became louder, heavier, and more frequent, like someone was smacking a hammer on the wall. And at this point, the possibility of the occurrences being caused by some kind of paranormal force hadn't even occurred to them. They just desperately wanted answers, some help from somewhere, and they couldn't think of anyone else to turn to than the police. I mean, the Goodins didn't even believe in ghosts. Yet. The consistent pounding on their walls continued for weeks on end, giving the family very little respite. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. For now. Almost exactly 1 year later, in November of 1972, the phone rang inside the police station. It was Jerry Goodin. The pounding had returned with a vengeance. Lieutenant Coco received the call. He was the very same officer they'd spoken to when the occurrences began the previous year. But this time, another officer offered to step in and help. After a brief chat about what was happening, the Goodins' neighbour, a police officer named John Holsworth, agreed to visit the house and record the sounds for himself. So, over the following months, the case began to snowball. Jerry was becoming paranoid and even explored the possibility that he was being pranked by a neighbour, maybe with some kind of grudge. But even after the neighbour in question sold up and moved away, the banging persisted. Police officers, fire departments, city engineers, they all got involved. Each had their own theories as to what was going on, but each theory had its flaws. None of them fit. Some suggested vibrations from a nearby construction site might be to blame, but that was ruled out too. The sounds came and went. A few days of silence, then back with a vengeance. It was rhythmic and became almost predictable. The Goodins would come to expect that every November the pounding would return. And sometimes it didn't sound like it was coming from outside at all. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. For years, the banging sounds continued to torment the poor family. Theories came and went, but there were never any culprits, no logical explanations, and no solution. School had never been easy for Marcia. Shy, overprotected, and now increasingly isolated, Marcia's ability to create social relationships had been severely hindered, resulting in her becoming an easy target for bullies, and it was brutal. What happened next had me absolutely fucking fuming. As a parent, if there's one thing I can't stand, it's bullies. Absolute pricks who pick on the vulnerable. It makes my blood boil, and I'm sure you'll feel exactly the same after hearing this next part. So intense was the abuse that one day a boy attacked Marcia so viciously she was left in a back brace and had to take extended leave from school. See what I mean? No child should ever have to suffer at the hands of someone else. I'd literally want to drag the little shit out of school and, well, I'll let you fill in the blanks. So, understandably, this was the final straw for the Goodins. Laura pulled her daughter out and arranged for her to be homeschooled, at least for the time being, while they looked for an alternative arrangement. But the options were limited. Homeschooling's very expensive, and the neighbourhood didn't offer much in terms of alternative options. So for now, Marcia stayed at home. And the house, once again, began to make her feel claustrophobic, almost like her prison. The joyful little house that had once echoed with the laughter of a happy child now felt completely different. It was lonely, cold, and filled with a sense of dread. It was around this time that everything began to change. One autumn night, as the family sat down together to watch TV, Laura heard 3 distinct knocks at the front door. Now, the Goodins didn't have too many visitors, so the knocks came as a surprise to them all. Curious, she got up off the sofa, hesitantly walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. But to Laura's surprise, she could see nobody standing on the front porch. So she turned around to return to the sofa. As she was about to step away from the door, there was 3 more knocks on the door, louder this time, loud enough to make her jump. Spooked, she placed her hand on the doorknob, turned it, and opened the door. Still, there was absolutely no one there. "Who is it?" Jerry shouted from the living room. There's nobody there," Laura responded, her voice breaking slightly. Laura glanced down at the floor, just for a second, but long enough for a chill to run straight down her spine. On the floor was a set of wet footprints. Now, you might be thinking, there's nothing that strange about that. Well, it is strange when it hasn't rained for weeks and the floor is bone dry. From that moment on, the activity in the house escalated dramatically. Doors began opening and slamming shut by themselves. Chairs would shift position and scrape along the floor when no one was looking. Lights would turn on and off when nobody was near the switch. And then came the moment that took away any doubt from Jerry Goodin that this might be paranormal. It was an image that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a mild autumn evening, Jerry popped into the kitchen to grab a snack. As he entered the kitchen, for the briefest of moments he saw a hand pressed against the window glass. Now this in itself might be enough to unnerve most people, but the situation was a whole lot creepier than someone's hand pressed up against the window, because it quite literally was just a hand. No arm, no body, and it was unnaturally pale, as if they were wearing a white glove. But as soon as Jerry registered exactly what he was seeing, it slid away and vanished. You could suggest that perhaps he'd imagined it, that he was just seeing things, if it wasn't for the fact that for a few seconds after the hand slid away, a handprint remained on the glass. Jerry burst out of the door into the yard, hoping that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong, and that there was an intruder in the garden. But his instincts proved him right. The yard was empty. On the cold, dark night of November 21st, 1974, the Goodins were hosting the Holsworths for dinner. Everyone had congregated in the living room. The sound of conversation and clinking cutlery filled the house. There was laughing and joking complemented by a relaxed atmosphere, until a loud, sharp sound cut through it all. The sound was unmistakable. It was the sound of glass shattering. They all ran to the master bedroom to see what all the commotion was about. There, underneath the window, the floor was covered with shards of broken glass. In a state of utter disbelief, Jerry and Laura ushered the children away from the glass before Jerry searched the floor for whatever it was that had been thrown through the window to cause the smash. Nothing on the floor seemed immediately obvious, so he turned his attention to the window itself. He looked out of the window to see if he could catch the culprit running away. That's when something strange caught his attention. It wasn't just strange, it was chilling. The outside pane was still intact. It was the inside pane, the one that had been facing the room, that had been smashed, meaning that the glass could only have been smashed from inside the house. The problem was, nobody was in that bedroom when the glass smashed. That night, the pounding on the walls grew louder and louder than ever before. A furious drumming sound reverberated around the house, as if something had been unleashed. And yet, that wasn't the worst of it, because the next day, the Bridgeport Poltergeist would truly reveal itself. That night, the pounding on the walls grew even louder. That night, the pounding on the walls grew louder than ever before. A furious drumming sound reverberated around the house as if something had been unleashed. And yet, that wasn't the worst of it, because the next day, the Bridgeport Poltergeist would truly reveal itself. It started like any normal Friday night. Nothing weird, nothing strange, just a regular Friday evening. Jerry came home from work exhausted after his long shift and collapsed into his chair, ready to have dinner with Laura and Marcia. After they'd eaten, absolutely stuffed from all the food, they took a few minutes for their dinner to go down. Then the three of them moved to the living room to relax. After they'd eaten, absolutely stuffed from all the food, they took a few minutes for their dinner to go down, and then the three of them moved to the living room to relax. Marcia sat on the floor and continued working on a puzzle that she'd started just before her dad had arrived home. The door to the master bedroom, which was visible to all three of them, was shut. They settled down to watch a film. They decided on one they'd all enjoy, then sat back and relaxed. After a few minutes, Jerry sat forward with a serious look on his face. He grabbed the remote, pressed the mute button, then held his index finger up to his lip, gesturing for Laura and Marcia to remain quiet. He was convinced that he'd heard a sound coming from that bedroom. Not the usual banging this time. This was something different. He got up from his chair and slowly walked over to the bedroom door and creaked it open. The shade on the broken window had just rolled itself up. Now, no one had been anywhere near it, but in the process of rolling up, it had knocked the curtains down. This was a bit weird, definitely, but could be explained away with logic. Maybe it had just come loose. So Jerry rehung the curtains, rolled the shade back down, and checked everything was secure. then checked once more for good measure. Once he was happy, he turned to leave. Literally, the second he turned his back to the window, the whole curtain rod crashed to the floor. Laura, who was standing in the bedroom doorway at this point, looked at Jerry dead in the eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look of absolute fear on her face said it all. She was terrified. Jerry placed the curtain pole neatly on the floor for the time being, then exited the bed. Jerry placed the curtain pole neatly on the floor for the time being, then exited the bedroom and closed the door behind him. Half an hour later, already on edge, all three of them nearly jumped out of their skins when it happened again. Only this time, it was in the kitchen. Then came the knocking again, slow and gentle, like it was toying with them. It started soft and slow, but grew faster and louder and angrier. Whatever it was trying its very best to strike the fear of God into the Goodin family, and it was having great success. Marcia just froze, sat there on the carpet like a statue, too afraid to move. She was used to these noises by now, but this was the first time she'd really seen fear in her parents' eyes. And then, once again, the banging just stopped, leaving the room in total silence. But don't be fooled. This wasn't the peaceful, ambient sort of silence. No, this was the eerie, ominous, calm before the storm sort of silence.